Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest Inslee, and in this episode we'll be talking to Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley, Keetoowah Cherokee teacher, theologian, activist, farmer, and the author of several books. In our conversation today, we focus on the native theology of land and environment, a subject of particular interest to Earthkeepers, who have come to understand the Western world's desperate need for new ways of being in and with creation.
But it's not that way. We're not above everything else. We're not below everything else. We are simply a part of everything else. We have our jobs to do, and everything else has its job to do. And they're all important, and they're all related. So we would even say that the breath of God, the Spirit, the life force, if you will, is in everything. And so then everything then has dignity on earth and should be treated as such. When we have that kind of relationship and understand the tree is my relative, the frog is my relative, the birds are my relatives, you know, that we're all related to one another and we're in some way. And what we do to each affects everything else.
Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast.
So in 1998, I had a dream, and it was sort of like a vision dream. Woke my wife up, told her about it, and it was basically the gist of it was to move back to Cherokee country. We were living, I was pastoring a church in Carson City, Nevada at the time, a native church, to begin a center of sorts where we would train folks in all kinds of ways, leaders. Of course, at that time, theology and Bible was a big thing, but also just about the land and permaculture and just like relationship with the earth, and then also organizing, like how do we organize in our communities, and then economic development, how on the reservation do you make a living, right? So we'd been involved serving our Native people for many, many years in lots of different ways. And so this seemed like the right thing to do, a place where people could come and have ceremony and do all of that together. And we for 4 years, we traveled around, put like 60,000 miles a year on our van and homeschooled our kids who were all smaller at the time. And eventually we found a place in Kentucky. We had that place for 2 years before trouble started. And the trouble started was our own success. We built it from scratch. It became a farm. It became a community. It became a school. We would have weekend schools, extended weekend schools, and we'd have 40, 50 people who would come. Half would be native and half non-native. And in the non-natives, half of them, so a quarter of the people came, were involved in some kind of like pastors to native people or missionaries or something. And so we were having a lot of good effect, I think. And it wasn't just us, of course. We were my friend Richard Twiss and Terry LeBlanc and Ray Aldred and Fern Cloud, and a lot of our sort of gang would teach. And then we were run off basically by a group of paramilitary white supremacists with a 50 caliber machine gun who would fire that on our property day and night. We couldn't get help from the attorney general or the state's attorney general or the fair housing or the justice department. And so we ended up having to sell when the bottom dropped out of the economy. And so in 2008, we moved to Oregon, and I was able to get a adjunct position at George Fox, Portland Seminary. And then I worked my way up into a full-time position. Now I'm sort of working my way back down. In the meantime, we tried to replicate sort of what we were doing with a small farm that we were able to purchase later in Newberg, Oregon. It was just very small, 3 acres. And we were having success, but we couldn't really do the big stuff, right? Summits and big schools. And so we eventually sold that this past year. And in April, we moved into a 10-acre place in Yamhill, Oregon. We began again the third iteration, with the final iteration, we hope and pray, of Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Eloheh Farm and Seeds. So I guess we're still carrying on the same vision. This is a place, though, finally, that we can actually see it come to fruition. I don't think we're going to be run off by white supremacists this time. So I think we're in good shape. So, and my wife, Edith, and I are co-sustainers of this project. We've been doing it together. Now we've been carrying this vision for 21 years.
So when you talk about people coming to you to learn and doing classes and summits, what actually are you giving to people in those times? What are they coming for?
Yeah, I ask myself that same question all the time. It's like, what is it? I mean, because people leave and they talk about their lives being transformed and their worldview changed. And my wife and I look at each other and go, we're just like doing what we do. we live here and we do what we do, and we host other people, invite them to come and join us. And I think it's a combination of the display of the lived experience of ceremony and teaching and getting your hands in the dirt and understanding the big picture. And I think it takes people from a Western worldview and it converts them to a more indigenous worldview. Because, the Western world doesn't do that. The Western world basically, by and large, the philosophy has been to transfer knowledge, right? And knowledge is what's in your head. But this is a more holistic experience, and it literally is an experience that people go through that they walk away and changed. And we're glad, but I mean, in terms of a model, we sort of have a vision and we live our lives, but I guess we could write up a model based on what we do, but there's no big philosophy. It's just, I guess, Indians doing what Indians do.
I've been influenced by your book, Shalom and the Community of Creation, and I recommend it to my students. In fact, the board of Circlewood, the parent organization of this podcast, we all read the book together as well. And I can say that from a non-native perspective, there is a hunger for a different way of seeing, a different way of being. So I'm wondering if that's what people are responding to. They're coming for something different, even if they're not able to say what that different thing is.
Exactly. We've been doing this for over 30 years. I think 33 years now. The message is, hopefully gotten more specific over the years and more wisdom, but basically we've been saying the same thing for all these years. And it's just, I think in the last 4 or 5 years that all of a sudden there's just this opening, right? And you mentioned Shalom and the Community of Creation and Indigenous Vision. That book I wrote in, I think, 2010. All of a sudden it got a second life and everybody's reading it and quoting it. And it's like, okay, well, this is what we've been waiting for. And I'm really happy that I lived to see this sort of societal interest and change in what Indigenous people have to say, but just a whole different worldview, because the Western worldview is the cause, I believe, of the destruction of the planet. That's a big statement, but I really believe that the Platonic dualism that's been embraced by the West, there are all these sort of derivatives from that flow, these, the hierarchies and greed and the patriarchies and the anthropocentrism, the thinking, humans are above nature, and all of those kinds of things flow out of that Platonic dualism. For the last 500 years, it really hasn't done the world or the earth any good. There's been a few people have gotten rich, over the years. And I guess that's enough to make people want to keep it going. But I don't think that Western worldview will sustain us in the future. We won't be able to maintain our privilege as people who are earthkeepers, harmony, people who restore harmony and balance to the earth and to our communities.
So what do you think is causing the shift in interest, or maybe we'll say causing the shift in some people to realize that the old way is not working?
It's a really good question. Of course, social media has given everyone a voice now. So it's created a bit more democracy where everyone has a say. And when everyone has a say, it might look like chaos, but sometimes chaos is actually a good thing. And in fact, I would argue that our Creator's vision of how the earth operates is very much akin to chaos. What we think is orderly is actual chaos. So if you look at, let me just give an example. If you look at how we build stuff, whether it's a system or whether it's a building or whatever, it's a closed system and it's built to collapse, right? And because we set these boundaries, whereas in nature adapts. And right now, what's happening with the climate change and everything else is nature is adapting. We've gotten out of harmony. Human beings have become the number one extractors of energy from the earth. We're out of balance. And so now the earth is literally, to quote a Bible phrase in Deuteronomy, spitting out its inhabitants through the fires and the floods and the hurricanes and the tornadoes and the earthquakes and et cetera. And so that may look like chaos to us, but that's actually nature putting things back in order. And so we've got to come more in line with what creation is doing. We've got to understand it. We've got to work with it. We've got to create open systems and non-homogeneous systems, because nature works on a principle of diversity as well. The West has coveted this homogeneity. White supremacy is a good example of that, or male patriarchy. And that's not how creator operates. That's not how nature operates. That's part of it. We have to convert away from a Western worldview. If you ask that question, it's a really good question. Let me take you back 500 years. And the same things that we're experiencing are very, very much, many of the same things Europe was experiencing. England in particular, but much of Western Europe. The fisheries had in the bays were all fished out. The rivers were all polluted. The creeks, they couldn't drink the water. Only the wealthy, 1%, were basically getting justice. There was no ability to sort of move up in class. They had cut down all their oak woods. Only the king had certain private woods left. You couldn't hunt in them. Large mammals were going extinct, and some did. All of these horrible, horrible things that are happening now in our country and around the world were happening back then. And what I would argue is the cause is the same Western worldview. That's the link.
When you say we, I'm wondering who we is. And I'm thinking in terms of the book that you wrote recently, Decolonizing Evangelicalism with Bo Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly part of the we problem is the church, the evangelical church in particular in the US. I guess my basic question, and this might not be a fair question, but my basic question in reading that book was, really, you believe that evangelicalism can be decolonized? Do you have hope for the church as an agent of this change? Do you think that the church could actually be changed in its way that it views and treats the rest of creation?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So we state at the beginning of the book that our goal is not to rescue evangelicalism, but that there is enough sort of good history and things in it that we need to at least critique it fairly and critique it harshly. So the goal of the book is not to do that, but if evangelicalism decides to decolonize and indigenize, that would just be a wonderful thing. I sort of don't live in the Christian bubble, so a lot of what we do is community-based and oriented, and we don't just appeal to what I call the Christian ghetto, right? But one of the things that the church has that is sometimes lacking in other places is this idea of hope. Now, the hope may be in the wrong thing. Their hope may be placed on heaven or some kind of otherworldliness, which is, again, this dualism exhibited. But when there is hope for something better, you can sometimes move people to, I think, what about now? What about the way that we live right now? And so it would be, I think, foolish if you're trying to change the world to neglect those folks. The other thing is that there are plenty, and I, in my courses that I teach at a master's level, generally I'm teaching like 24 to 45-year-olds, something like that. There is this hunger to sort of reject the traditional church, but somehow hang on to God, right? I think that change that we're watching is sort of, they're just waiting for people to say, okay, here's what you can do. Now, sometimes they're getting burned out by too much protesting or too much decolonizing or trying to change all the light bulbs in their house and all the sort of different things. And they want sort of like, how do I get out off the hamster wheel? And I think at that point, Indigenous people, many much wiser than me, have some answers for them. They have some stories. They have ways of communicating that will help them sort of understand that embracing this kind of chaos is actually the next step of a better world. And so it's sort of like we're picking up both, I guess you'd say, a lot of people who are burnt out from the church and trying to give them new hope.
I had an interview with Tri Robinson, who's a rancher in Idaho and an author of books about greening the church, basically. And he makes the point that while evangelicalism, the evangelical church might be the foundation or the jumping off point, he sees that the various crises and challenges that we're facing now are the things that are going to be the impetus for a new way of doing church. And it's the people who have rejected the church, maybe the younger folks who don't see the old models as relevant, but also people who've left because, as you say, they've been burned out or just don't have hope for the old model. And so his hope is actually in the people who are willing to recreate, to think entirely on new terms in terms of what does church mean? What does it mean to be the community of people, of Christ followers?
Yeah. Sort of those early to mid 20-year-olds right now. This is the first generation since my baby boomer generation. One of the things living through the baby boom generation was to see, like we said, we don't want the same paradigm, right? We want a different paradigm. And this was the Vietnam War, Nixon's corruptness, really the beginning of globalization, the opening of China and all this, the oil crises, all of these kinds of things. Earth Day came about at that time. And people said, we don't want the same paradigm. And then there's lots of critique about what happened. But this new generation, I've noticed a bit different than the last two generations in between. And they said, we don't want the same paradigm. And we're willing to get out and do something about it. And so to me, that is so exciting. They want to change the world, and the world needs changing.
What do you think folks who are perhaps more invested in the older forms can do to actually support that? Or do they have any role at all?
Just get out of the way.
Right. Yeah. Tri said, just don't resist it. Don't judge it.
Yeah. I mean, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Right now, we have lots of people reacting to.
Yeah, we sure do.
Yeah. I have a whole new vocabulary that I use. So I don't use the word church much. I use community, because I think part of the problem has been that antiseptic bubble we call the church. And we've understood it as God is at work in the church. And in my 64 years, I think what I've seen is God is much more at work outside the church than in the church. And so we have to begin to think in terms of our communities as opposed to our churches. There's just a lot of baggage terms that need to be dropped and begin to think differently.
So I want to back up and just kind of do some definition of these bigger ideas we're talking about. Can you, in a nutshell, talk about what a colonized theology is? What is the problem that you and Bo are addressing in your book? And we'll start there.
You have to really go back to the Constantinian era, right? So Constantine was concerned with empire. Christianity becomes married with empire. Later on in the early Middle Ages, the popes began to declare their power over government rather than working with it or as it. And this is where, of course, everybody's dealing right now with the doctrines of discovery and the Crusades before, as that came about in the middle and late Middle Ages. And that empire, that notion of empire, has never really been separated from neither Catholicism nor Protestantism, nor the ones who don't claim to be any of them. There's a lot of characteristics of empire. What is empire but this forced expansion, right? And so when you examine American Christianity, at least, you see that it's very controlling, both theologically, and that's part of the problem too, is that these products of the mind, that's again the Platonic dualism, the products of the mind, we invest in those more. So the most important thing is our doctrine, and in Europe, they're willing to kill each other over it. And then in the United States, we have so many breaks with these denominations and groups, and they just keep on splintering. My background's with the American Baptists, and so I understand a bit of the Baptist history probably better than any. It's sort of like if you disagree over color of the carpet or anything else, you just go start a new denomination, right? We tend to end up thinking that that these products of the mind are more important than people's actual lived experience. So that's not at all how I understand Jesus. How I understand Jesus is actually condemning those who take a strict view of the law over the experiences in the lives of people. And I think we've sort of ended up on the wrong side of that equation. So the church has become very much like the Pharisees. And so it needs people acting like Jesus to call it out and change.
As you can tell from our conversation with Randy Woodley so far, Earthkeepers podcast is committed to giving voice to hard truths that challenge us all to better love and serve creation. At the same time, this podcast is about finding hope when so much that is happening in our world invites us to despair. In our efforts to promote hope, we want to invite you to a free 1-hour webinar called Signs of Hope that will highlight some of the encouraging movements in earth care that are emerging both globally and locally. Please join us on Thursday, October 29th, 2020 from 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You'll find more information about that event on our organization's website at www.circlewood.online/events, where you can also sign up to let us know that you're coming. Again, that's Thursday, October 29th, 2020 from 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'd love to see you there. Talking about the experience of Native people as sort of one representative group of the people who've paid a price for this mindset, can you talk about American history in particular and how that has played out and what it has really cost us in terms of where we are now?
The Church of Empire that came over here already, like the Church of England, already assumed that they had dominion of the land, that they own the land. And then there was a lot of questions just prior to that, whether Native people were actually humans or not. And the Spanish were arguing over that for quite a while, the Spanish and the Portuguese in particular. And so in all of their European views, we were at least subhuman, if not non-human.
And this was justified theologically.
Absolutely. Lots of scriptures and lots of doctrines created to justify that. The problem was we were on land that Christians wanted, right? That the governments who claim to be Christians wanted. And so the strange thing about Europeans is they will do evil things, but they have to rationalize them. And so the church has taken on that mantle of rationalizing these things with scripture and doctrine. And, you can find a Bible verse or scripture to back up just about any kind of genocide, right? Some of the earliest theologians, Cotton Mather, for example, says, after slaughtering a peaceful village, so much so setting their huts on fire, but there was so much blood, he says, that from them running them through with their swords and stuff, that it would even begin to put out the fires. And he said some people might question whether women and children should be killed this way, but the scripture so demands it. And that attitude has really plagued both the United States government and the church, which the church most often, unfortunately, has acted as a poor imitation of a bad model. So they've sort of taken on the mantle of the government and those positions, and we see it happening right now, as opposed to being able to accept what government is good and reject what's not and stand up against it. And that's how I understand the life of Jesus. So it's so simple. It's like, we just need to act more like Jesus.
Let me ask you about the implications of decolonizing evangelicalism or decolonizing theology in terms of the land, in terms of creation care. What does that really do to think in terms of stepping outside of of the old constraints and thinking in new ways about our relationship to the land?
I'm going back to the Platonic dualism again, because that dualism hangs everybody up, because it creates doctrines like saving our soul, like Jesus is here to save our soul, as opposed to save everything, right? Jesus is listed 5 different scriptures by 3 different authors as the creator, having the efficacy of creation. But there's no room in most of our doctrines for that. He has to be this savior to save our souls. But when he becomes the creator and has a particular incarnation and a particular life and ministry and a particular death, those all become equally important, right? And we begin to understand that there's something worth dying for on this earth, that this whole earth and all its creatures are worth dying for, rather than just saving my individual soul. So the individualism is one of the byproducts of the Platonic dualism, as is the utopianism, which basically says we've got a home in heaven, we're just passing through. So the doctrine ends up being, I'm a bad person put on this bad earth, but I get saved through Jesus, who saves my soul that's going to heaven one day, and I leave this earth behind. And that is a horrible theology, and that's the crux of evangelicalism right there.
What about people's relationship to the land itself? That your connection to the land, people's connection to the land, is critical in ways that a Western worldview tends not to recognize.
This is even a concern, and I don't want to pick a fight with environmentalists, but this is a concern I have with Western environmentalism. It still, in the end, ends up being utilitarianism. I want it to last longer so that we can use it more, right? Whether it's recreation or this crazy idea that for something to be pristine, humans can't be a part of it. In some ways, it's sort of like a safety net, because it's like, well, if humans are a part of it, they'll destroy it, right? so maybe the park system's good in that it didn't allow humans to be a part, which they naturally are a part of the environment. We're just a part of it, right? Our human place is to keep that balance and to restore harmony. But that's how I understand it anyway. That's what it means to be human. So if it's not utilitarian, even in the nicest sense, what is it? Well, it's realizing that we are part of the land. We're just walking land. We are part of this great circle. And many religions, not just Christianity, have human beings at the very top and then everything else sort of under in this hierarchy. But it's not that way. We're not above everything else. We're not below everything else. We are simply a part of everything else. We have our jobs to do, and everything else has its job to do. And they're all important, and they're all related. So we would even say that the breath of God, the Spirit, the life force, if you will, is in everything. And so then everything then has dignity on earth and should be treated as such. When we have that kind of relationship and understand the tree is my relative, the frog is my relative, the birds are my relatives, that we're all related to one another, and we're in some way. And what we do to each affects everything else. So it's hard for Western people to especially Christians, because they're, you're worshiping the earth, or you're worshiping the tree, which is crazy. I've never known an Indian who worshiped anything in the world, but it's that those things actually given life through creator, and creator is a part of all of that, as creator is a part of us. When I see a tree, it's not just about the bored feet that I can get out of it, but it's like, what is that tree's function? And if I have to take that tree, then there's got to be ceremony and respect for its life, and understanding that there's a loss also, not just a gain for me.
We need to indigenize our worldview.
Yeah.
And that presents to me a challenge. It's a little hard to get my head around it, because I'm just wondering, how do you bring people who are not in a tradition into that tradition? People who are not indigenous, how do you allow them or help them or encourage them to share in a perspective that is not inherently theirs?
Yeah. Great question. Because, in the old days, so my degree is along the lines of anthropology. It's in intercultural studies. And in the old days, they said worldviews are immutable. They can't be moved. Once you got one, you can't get it out of you. And what we found with globalization and people having to live in several different worlds is it's a term the anthropologists came up with called indigenous cosmopolitanism, that people can actually live and operate out of not just two different cultures, but two different worldviews. Think about it. Women have been doing that all the time. They have to operate both from a man's worldview and their own worldview because, men have sort of been in power and you gotta know who's in control you gotta know the game to win it, I guess you'd say. So we can change a worldview. But it doesn't come through just like teaching. It has to be caught. More is caught than taught. That's always been my pedagogy and my understanding. It's that our lived experience ends up being probably more important than the content of the things that we end up knowing. But the other thing is that Americans are if they're anything, they're pragmatic, right? So very practical people. I think it's easy to say, this worldview, when you critique it and decolonize from it, this worldview has gotten us into this mess. I can point directly, like I said, there's that thread from Europe, for example, and it's not going to sustain us anymore. It's not going to sustain your great grandchildren. But an indigenous perspective, an indigenous worldview has been able to be on this continent, for millenniums. Native people weren't born with the idea of, we know how to get along. It developed over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. And over those thousands of years, people sort of learned how to live on this Turtle Island, what we call Turtle Island, North America, in a way that will sustain both people and creation. And in case people have the idea that Native people were all uncivilized and everyone lived in a teepee or a grass hut and was hiding behind trees, half naked when white people arrived. That's not at all the history of Native Americans. We had incredible philosophy and medical and medicines and surgeries, democracies, and all of these wonderful things that were going on here. But Americans aren't supposed to know about that because they're supposed to, our job, according to the Western worldview, is to disappear because we were never much anyway, right? And that's stated throughout all of history. So the fact that more Native people are actually learning to span both worlds and being able to teach, like, for example, I teach a session called America Before Columbus in some of my courses. And we had great civilizations in lots of places and incredible technologies. We were feeding tens of thousands of people in desert, dry areas, engineered roads, and all these kinds of things in large towns, cities of 40, 50,000. In my courses, someone always says this, a student always asks the same thing, because these are master students. So they've been already through 4 years of college, and they're like, how could this be that I don't know all this stuff? And my answer is always the same. You weren't supposed to learn it. History has been written so you don't learn these things. Because if you see that we were actually valuable, and not that we have to have a civilization that copies, I think we actually had a much better, more diverse and more tolerant civilizations. But then you have to deal with, well, that's the kind of people. See, that subhumanness is still a part of thinking about Native Americans, right? So then it's like, they had things that I value going on and we wiped them out. So now we got to deal with that.
About 10, 11 years ago, I asked Richard Twiss about why he thought people were not paying attention to the wisdom of indigenous worldviews. And I've heard him say this in other places, but he again said that people, the church in particular, can't hear the corrective voice from the margins because Native people have been relegated to the mission field, right? So they are the receivers, the beneficiaries of the blessings of the dominant culture, the dominant church. And so that puts them by definition in a sub or subordinated place. And therefore you can't listen to them. But I'm wondering if that is changing.
It is changing. And, Richard died, I think it was February 9th. I can't remember the exact date, but 2013. He was one of my best friends. We did a lot together. We were a cohort in our doctoral studies together, and we hung together a lot. But yeah, he would have a lot to say right now about what's going on. because I think this is the day that he was looking forward to. We are moving away. More and more natives are standing up and saying, we're not that sort of like subhuman, poor Indian, what can we do for you? We are people who really are your salvation. They asked Mother Teresa one time, Mother Teresa, why did Jesus say the poor will always be with you? And she said, because the rich can only be saved if the poor are here. Mm-hmm. And I actually believe that, and I like the word healing, I think is a better theological word, and even biblically in most cases for salvation. We are the means of white folks healing. Mm-hmm. It's when they begin to learn from us, when there's a transfer of empowerment, if you will. And that's never happened. Yeah, Richard's right on. And I think we're seeing it change. I'm hopeful anyway.
Do you, in your understanding of the potential of healing, wisdom, healing, understanding coming from Indigenous folks, do you understand that to include other Indigenous cultures around the world?
Absolutely. I think there's some commonality. There's one other thing I wanted to mention is that when we talk about converting people to an Indigenous worldview, what I'm talking about is not Indigenous ceremony or everybody trying to be Indians or something like that. What we're talking about is taking on the values that have sustained us for all these years. My PhD dissertation was on these native values in the Harmony Way, as we call it. The closest biblical equivalent for Christians would be the big picture shalom. But those values, it's funny, when I did my doctoral dissertation, 60% of the students at my graduate school were from other countries. And as we began to talk to people from South Africa and so Zulus, people from Kenya and other Maasai, and people from South America and Malaysia and Hawaii, Maoris in New Zealand and Aboriginals in Australia, and et cetera, they all related to those same values in that same Harmony Way system. So these are what I believe are the original instructions for humankind. What we need to do is get back to those basic human values. And of course, my belief is the more human you are, the more spiritual you are. We were put on earth to be human beings, not something different. And so we just need to fulfill our role as human beings in order to be spiritually complete.
We've been in conversation with Native professor, theologian, and wisdom keeper Randy Woodley. If you want to know more about his writings or about Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice, you'll find information and links in this episode's show notes. There, you'll also find a link to his book, Shalom and the Community of Creation, an Indigenous Vision, a book I strongly recommend to everyone in the Earthkeepers community. You'll also find a link to Eloheh Seeds, where you can purchase unique varieties of organic, open-pollinated seeds. When you go to the Earthkeepers website, check out our new voice messaging option. We would love to hear your Earthkeeping success stories or your thoughts on particular episodes, your ideas for future episodes, or even questions that you have for us. We want to hear from you. Of course, you can also send us an email at podcast@circlewood.online. We invite you to become a financial supporter of Earthkeepers. Please visit our website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers to make a donation that will help expand the reach and frequency of this production. It also helps us immensely when you leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And please share this podcast with anyone you know who seeks to become an agent of change and advocacy for the good of the earth. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. I'm Forrest Tinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.